The evening air was thick with humidity, a typical summer in the city. As the ambulance sped through the winding streets. Inside, the atmosphere was tight, filled with the sound of Claire's labored breathing and the rhythmic hum of the sirens wailing through the traffic. She was in her early 30s. Her face contorted in pain, eyes squeezed shut as she gripped Mark's hand. Her contractions were becoming unbearable, and each wave of pain seemed to stretch time itself. Just hold on a little longer, Claire, Mark whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. His own heart was pounding, though not from the exertion of running a marathon, but from the terrifying thought that their baby might not make it in time. He looked down at his wife, feeling a mixture of helplessness and love surge within him. His mind raced. Was the hospital too far? Would they make it in time? Outside the ambulance, the world seemed indifferent to their urgency. The streets were clogged with cars, drivers oblivious to the flashing lights that screamed for their attention. Mark's gaze kept flicking to the clock on the dashboard. They were so close, yet the seconds felt like hours. Alex, the young EMT at the front, kept his composure, his voice calm as he reassured Claire. "We're 5 minutes away," he said, though the words were hardly enough to ease the growing panic. Alex was no stranger to emergencies. But this was different. The weight of this particular situation, of holding another person's life in his hands, seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. He kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel, knowing that Claire's life and the life of her unborn child depended on him getting them to the hospital in time. Mark turned his attention back to his wife. She was sweating now, her face pale, her breathing shallow and quick. It was hard for him to see her like this. They'd talked about the birth for months, what it would be like. The excitement, the anticipation, but no one had warned him about how vulnerable he would feel in this moment. Nothing had prepared him for this, for the helplessness of watching her suffer. "Alex, are you sure we're close?" Mark asked, his voice thick with worry. "We are," Alex said, glancing back for a moment to offer a reassuring smile, though it was clear that he, too, was feeling the pressure. "Just hold on. We'll be there soon." But just as he spoke, the unthinkable happened. The ambulance, which had been weaving skillfully through traffic, slowed to a halt. Mark's heart lurched. Outside the window, a police car, its lights flashing, had pulled directly into their path. The officer, a tall man with an expression of indifference, stood in front of the vehicle, his hand raised to stop them. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice rising with confusion and concern. Was the officer not seeing the flashing lights? The urgent medical emergency unfolding inside the ambulance? Alex, looking through the side mirror, sighed. He already knew what was happening. It was one of those moments where logic and urgency collided. But the reality was that, in this moment, they would have to play by the officer's rules. The officer approached the ambulance, his eyes scanning the vehicle before his gaze settled on Alex. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone firm, like it was just another routine traffic stop. "What are you doing?" Mark exploded, gripping Claire's hand tighter. "You can't be serious. My wife is in labor. We need to get to the hospital now." His voice cracked with the strain of his emotions, as panic slowly started to take root in his chest. But Officer Davis didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at the ambulance and then back at Alex. "It's protocol," he said flatly. "I need to see your papers. No exceptions." Alex opened his mouth to respond, but Mark was already out of his seat, moving quickly to the door. He wasn't thinking straight anymore. His mind was clouded with fear. "You're stopping an ambulance for paperwork," he yelled. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Claire groaned in pain, the contraction hitting harder than before. She winced, squeezing Mark's hand, and her eyes fluttered open, a silent plea for him to keep calm. She wasn't sure she could take much more of this, and the fear that gripped her heart was mirrored in Mark's. Alex, who had been watching the exchange, knew he needed to take charge. He stepped between Mark and Officer Davis, speaking in the calm, measured tone that he had learned over years of responding to high-pressure situations. "Officer, this is a medical emergency. We don't have time for a traffic stop. Please. We need to move. It's urgent." But Davis wasn't swayed. "I'm just following procedure," he insisted. "If you're breaking the law, I have to deal with it. I can't just let you pass without verification." The situation was deteriorating quickly. Mark's frustration was mounting, his temper flaring with every second that passed. He wanted to shout, to demand the officer understand the severity of the situation. But his words felt useless. Empty. His eyes darted back to Claire, who was now trembling from the pain. The sound of her groaning, of her labor intensifying with every breath, felt like a pressure on his chest. For the first time in his life, Mark truly understood the helplessness of the situation. The overwhelming sense that he could do nothing to fix what was wrong, nothing to ease his wife's pain, was unbearable. He stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The tension in the ambulance was palpable. Mark's heart raced, and his breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as he tried to process the absurdity of the situation. Every second felt like a lifetime. Claire was slipping further into distress, her face pale and drenched in sweat, each contraction hitting harder than the last. She gasped for air, her eyes widening in fear as the pain intensified. Mark's mind was spinning. How could this be happening? How could someone, anyone, block an ambulance carrying a woman in active labor? This was supposed to be the moment they had been preparing for, a moment of joy and anticipation, but instead, it had become a nightmare. Claire needed to get to the hospital. And fast. Her life, and the life of their baby, depended on it. "Alex, please, just get us out of here," Mark pleaded, his voice trembling. His desperation was mounting with every passing second. He reached for the door handle again, his eyes locked on the officer who remained stubbornly in front of them. Alex, who had been trying to stay calm, was now visibly tense. He could feel the rising anxiety in the air. The officer wasn't backing down, and the urgency of the situation was becoming more and more critical by the second. Alex had been in plenty of high-pressure situations. He had seen accidents, trauma, and medical emergencies of all kinds, but this felt different. There was something uniquely frustrating about trying to save a life when someone, especially an officer of the law, was standing in your way. "Officer, please," Alex said firmly, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of frustration. "You're delaying a medical emergency. My patient is in labor, and every second counts. I'm asking you to move so we can continue to the hospital." The officer, still unmoved, looked Alex up and down, his expression unreadable. He hadn't even acknowledged the urgency of the situation, and that made Alex's frustration bubble to the surface. He had trained for this. He had been in situations where every decision mattered, where a person's life hung in the balance. But this was different. The officer wasn't just disregarding protocol, he was ignoring the lives at stake. "Let's make this quick." "All right," Officer Thompson finally said, his tone still flat, though there was a subtle trace of impatience in his voice. "License and registration, please." Mark's anger flared. This was a nightmare that had no end in sight. "No, you're not listening. You're delaying my wife's delivery. If she's not getting to the hospital, she's going to." The words caught in his throat as he felt the weight of what he was saying, the fear that came with it. He couldn't bear the thought of Claire and their baby being harmed. He had promised her that everything would be okay. But how could he make her feel safe when an officer was standing in their way? Claire, struggling to breathe, lifted her hand weakly, grabbing Mark's arm. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with fear. "Mark, don't, we need to focus on getting there. Please." Her words hit him like a jolt. For the first time, He realized how much his panic was affecting her. He had to stay calm for her. He couldn't let fear and anger blind him to the real task at hand, getting her to safety. Alex, seeing the exchange, stepped forward once more. Please, officer. I'm not asking for much. Just let us go. This is an emergency. You can't stop us. The officer looked at him. Then at Mark, who was seething with frustration. For a moment, everything stood still. Then, as though sensing that the situation was about to escalate further, Officer Thompson finally relented. He stepped aside. But his words were cold. As if giving in didn't sit well with him. Fine, he said curtly. But there was no apology in his voice. You'd better hurry up. Mark could hardly believe it. He glanced at Alex, who nodded grimly, quickly getting the ambulance moving again. The sirens blared louder now, their urgency amplified by the intense pressure in the vehicle. Claire, weak from the pain, seemed to relax just slightly as the vehicle lurched forward. But Mark couldn't shake the anger still burning in his chest. He knew they were still far from out of danger. He didn't care about the officer's pride or his stubbornness. All that mattered was Claire. All that mattered was that she and their baby made it out of this alive. And for a brief moment, Mark allowed himself to feel relief. The ambulance was moving again. But that fleeting sense of peace evaporated quickly as he looked at his wife. Her pain hadn't subsided, it had only intensified. And as they continued to race toward the hospital, he couldn't help but think about how easily the night had been derailed by one person's lack of understanding. The ambulance sped through the streets, the flashing lights and blaring sirens cutting through the night. But even with the officer now out of their way, the tension didn't dissipate. The emotional weight of the encounter still hung heavy in the air. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Claire. Her face contorted in pain, her breath shallow and erratic. She was fading. And he could see it. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. Mark had thought that once they got past the officer, everything would return to normal. But the reality of the situation was so much more complicated. His mind raced with questions. How much time had they lost already? Would it be too late? His thoughts were interrupted when Claire let out a strangled cry, her eyes squeezing shut in agony. It was a cry that no one could ignore, not even the indifferent crowd that had begun to gather around the scene. As the ambulance continued on its way, Mark could see people standing on street corners, some taking out their phones, others simply staring. The energy around them had shifted from frustration to something else, something that felt almost like an overwhelming empathy. But then, as the ambulance passed a busy intersection, something unexpected happened. A car suddenly swerved in front of them, forcing Alex to slam on the brakes to avoid a collision. Mark's frustration hit a boiling point again. And in that moment, he snapped. "Why is this happening?" he muttered, his hands gripping the edge of the seat. "We're just trying to get her to the hospital." The seconds stretched on, unbearable and excruciating, as Alex expertly maneuvered the ambulance around the obstacle. He kept his cool, despite the pressure mounting on him from every direction. But Mark's eyes were fixed on Claire, who was clutching her stomach, her breathing labored and desperate. He couldn't help but feel utterly helpless. There was so much more to this than just getting to the hospital. There was an entire future at stake, his wife, their child, and everything they had dreamed of. And somewhere along the way, someone had forgotten that. As the ambulance began to move again, Mark glanced out the window. What had once been a quiet city street was now a small sea of people. All watching, all waiting. Some were still recording, their phones lifted high, capturing every second. The atmosphere had shifted. There was no longer an air of indifference, there was an undercurrent of anger now. A collective sense that something wrong had happened. And they all wanted to see it righted. Mark's thoughts turned to the police officer. Officer Thompson had come out of nowhere. And in that moment, it felt as though his selfishness and lack of understanding had taken something precious from them. But now, Mark saw the faces of the people watching, ordinary people. Many of them with no stake in the game except for their shared humanity. They were angry for him. They were angry for Claire. They understood what was at risk. And as the ambulance made its way further down the street, a change began to take place. The crowd, once just an audience to the chaos, started to shift their focus. The officers who had stood by with impassive expressions now found themselves surrounded by concerned civilians. Their phones still recording but now taking on a different role, documenting something larger than the confrontation. Something that transcended the individual fight. It was about justice. Mark's eyes widened as he saw the first signs of a shift in the officers' attitudes. It wasn't just the words spoken by the crowd or the increasing public pressure. It was the realization that people weren't just standing by. The moment Officer Thompson had created, with his careless disregard for the emergency, had sparked something deeper. People cared, and they would not allow the truth to go unspoken. Just as Mark began to feel like they might get the justice they needed, he saw 2 police cars appear in his rearview mirror, their lights flashing, their sirens blaring. The sirens weren't a warning this time, they were a signal of something more. Something that Mark had been waiting for. A senior officer stepped out from the lead car, his posture rigid, his face stern. He moved toward the crowd, and though his movements were measured, it was clear that he was taking charge of the situation. Officer Thompson, whose earlier resistance had seemed unshakable, now stood by with his shoulders slumped. Mark saw him look nervously at the senior officer, who approached the ambulance with an air of quiet authority. "Captain Morales," Alex said, his voice thick with exhaustion. But there was a glimmer of hope now. "We're in a medical emergency here. This delay is critical." Captain Morales nodded, his gaze briefly flicking to Officer Thompson before he addressed the gathered officers. "Step aside," he said sharply. "This situation has escalated far enough." Without another word, Captain Morales gave a clear order to the other officers, and they began to disperse, clearing the path for the ambulance. In that moment, Mark felt a wave of relief crash over him. It wasn't the complete resolution they had hoped for, but it was a start. The obstacles, both physical and emotional, were beginning to fade. And for the first time in what felt like forever, they were free to move forward. With Captain Morales stepping in, the crowd's outrage morphed into quiet satisfaction. The pressure on Mark and Claire finally started to lift, and the ambulance continued its journey to the hospital. Despite the chaos of the past moments, Mark couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for the people who had stood up, the ones who had refused to let the truth be buried. That moment would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder of the power of empathy, of standing together in the face of adversity. It was a reminder that sometimes justice had to be fought for, and that it would always be worth it. As the ambulance finally pushed forward, the overwhelming rush of emotion began to settle. Though the weight of the events that had unfolded hung over everyone like a thick cloud, Mark sat in the back, watching Claire, whose breathing had become shallow, the rhythm of her labor now dangerously erratic. His heart ached with each contraction she endured, each painful moan that escaped her lips. He had never felt so helpless, so vulnerable in his entire life. The past few moments had felt like a blur, everything moving too fast, too dangerously, too out of control. Yet, even as they raced toward the hospital, the consequences of Officer Thompson's actions were far from over. The officer's decision to obstruct their path had cost them precious time. Time that Claire could not afford to lose. Mark didn't even know if they would make it in time, if Claire and their child would survive this ordeal. It was a haunting thought, and one that gnawed at him relentlessly as they moved through the streets. Inside the ambulance, the mood was still tense. Alex, the EMT, maintained his professionalism, but even he couldn't ignore the lingering bitterness of the past few minutes. He glanced at Mark, who, despite his efforts to stay calm, had a look of quiet desperation in his eyes. "Hang in there, Mark," Alex said quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the hum of the sirens. "We're almost there." But Mark could only nod, his throat tight with anxiety. He appreciated Alex's attempt at comfort. But the uncertainty, the injustice of it all, still cut deeper than anything else. As they pulled into the emergency bay of the hospital, Mark's mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the aftermath. Officer Thompson's reckless actions had delayed them long enough to cause Claire's condition to worsen. The hospital staff rushed to unload Claire from the ambulance and get her stabilized. But Mark couldn't shake the rage that simmered inside him. His anger was not just for Claire, but for the sheer arrogance that had led Officer Thompson to disregard the severity of their situation. How could someone, anyone, look at a woman in labor and not see the urgency, the vulnerability, the fragile thread between life and death? When Claire was wheeled away into the operating room, Mark was left standing in the hallway, his mind spiraling with thoughts of what might come next. He was surrounded by doctors and nurses, but all he could focus on was the officer who had put them in this position in the first place. Officer Thompson's actions had jeopardized the well-being of his wife, his child, and he wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. Back at the scene of the traffic stop, Officer Thompson had been removed from his post by Captain Morales. But that didn't mean the situation was over. In fact, it was just beginning. Mark had no intention of letting Thompson's behavior go without consequences. The delay had been far too costly, and now, the repercussions were beginning to unfold. Captain Morales, who had stepped in to ensure that the ambulance was allowed to continue its journey, was already speaking with the higher-ups. The internal investigation had begun, and it was clear that the police force was not going to take this matter lightly. Officer Thompson had caused significant harm not just in delaying an ambulance, but in failing to recognize the gravity of the emergency unfolding before him. His actions were reckless, endangering not only the life of Claire and her child, but also the public trust in the very institutions meant to protect and serve. Within hours of the incident, a statement was issued by Police Chief R.Y. Alvarez. He condemned Thompson's behavior, calling it unacceptable and vowing that there would be consequences. Officer Thompson, who had initially tried to defend his actions, found himself on administrative leave, suspended from active duty as the investigation into his conduct moved forward. Mark didn't know what would come of the investigation or whether Thompson would ever face real consequences for his actions. But he knew one thing for certain: this couldn't be allowed to happen again. What Thompson had done wasn't just a failure of duty, it was a failure of humanity. And no matter what happened next, Mark would make sure that everyone knew the truth of what had transpired that night. As he sat in the hospital waiting room, still reeling from the adrenaline of the past few hours, Mark's thoughts turned to the future. Claire was in the operating room, and he was praying with everything he had that she and their baby would be okay. But there was a lingering sense of justice that still burned within him. He had to make sure that Officer Thompson faced the consequences of his actions, that the world would understand just how dangerous complacency could be. The doctors had assured him that they were doing everything they could. But the damage had already been done. Claire's labor had been severely complicated by the delay. Mark couldn't stop thinking about how a few minutes, just a few precious minutes, might have made all the difference. The hospital had done everything it could to save them. But Mark knew that the battle wasn't over yet. His fight for justice was just beginning. And no matter what happened to Officer Thompson, Mark would never forget the lessons learned that night. How a single act of negligence could change everything. How justice, even in the face of adversity, was worth fighting for. The cold fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital lingered in the air, filling Mark's senses with an unsettling sharpness. He paced the sterile hallways, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Claire had been in surgery for what felt like an eternity. Every second stretched into an unbearable weight that pressed against his chest. His anxiety growing with each passing minute. His thoughts cycled through the worst possible scenarios. And despite his best efforts to hold on to hope, he couldn't escape the crushing fear. In the waiting room, he sat down heavily, rubbing his hands over his face. He could still feel the sting of anger from the moments before they had reached the hospital. Officer Thompson's actions had made a difficult situation even more dangerous. And it was all Mark could do to not let that rage consume him. But right now, he had no room for anger. He had to focus on Claire, on the baby. He needed them to be okay. The door to the waiting room swung open, and Mark's father-in-law, Paul, stepped inside. Mark didn't need to look up to know it was him. Paul had always been a steady presence in his life, a voice of reason when things felt chaotic. But today, there was no comfort in his usual calm demeanor. Paul's eyes were tired, his face drawn with concern. "Any news?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse from the strain of waiting. Paul shook his head. "Nothing yet. I've been talking to the doctors. They're doing everything they can." Mark nodded, though the words barely registered. He couldn't bring himself to feel comforted by them. The delay caused by Officer Thompson had done more than just slow them down, it had jeopardized the very safety of the woman he loved and their unborn child. How could anyone, especially a police officer, not recognize the urgency of a woman in labor? It felt like an unforgivable mistake. Mark's fingers tightened into fists as the frustration and anger crept back in. Paul, sensing his son-in-law's distress, sat down next to him. "We'll get through this. Mark. Claire's strong. And that little one of hers," he smiled faintly, his voice cracking just slightly. "They're both fighters." Mark managed a tight smile, but his eyes remained fixed on the door to the operating room. The doctors had told him that Claire's condition was critical, that the delay had put unnecessary strain on her and the baby. An emergency C-section had been required to give them the best chance of survival. It was a terrifying reality, and every minute that passed felt like a battle against time. "How's the baby?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though he already feared the answer. Paul's face grew somber. "It's too early to say. The doctors are doing everything they can. We have to trust them." "Mark. But it's going to be touch and go for a while." Mark closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. He had always known that childbirth carried risks, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the feeling of being completely powerless, watching someone you love teetering on the edge between life and death. "We need to make sure Officer Thompson is held accountable," Paul said after a long silence, his tone firm and resolute. Mark looked up, meeting Paul's gaze. He didn't have to ask why. They both knew how much damage the officer's actions had caused. The fact that they were here, in this sterile, unforgiving hospital, was a direct result of that man's negligence. Officer Thompson had obstructed their path at a time when every second mattered. "I don't know what will happen," Mark said, his voice low, full of emotion. "But I will make sure this doesn't go unpunished. I won't let him hurt anyone else." Paul nodded, his expression hardening with determination. "We'll make sure of that. Mark. I'll take care of it. No one should ever have to experience what you've gone through." Just as Mark was about to respond, the door to the operating room opened, and a nurse stepped out. Her face was unreadable, and for a moment, Mark's heart skipped a beat. The silence stretched painfully thin. "Mr. Bennett?" she asked, addressing him with the formality of her profession. Mark stood quickly, his legs unsteady beneath him. "How is she? How's Claire? Is she okay?" The nurse hesitated for a moment before speaking. "She's stable for now. The C-section was successful, but she lost a lot of blood. We're monitoring her closely, but she's a fighter." Mark's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the all-clear he had hoped for, but it was a small relief. A lifeline in the midst of all the chaos. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but he had no words to ask. He simply nodded, his heart still pounding as the nurse led him to where Claire was being monitored. As he entered the room, His eyes immediately sought out Claire. She looked pale. Her breathing shallow but steady. A tangle of tubes and machines surrounded her. But to Mark, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. She was alive. She had made it. And so had their child. But the battle was far from over. The hospital room, with its faint hum of machines and sterile ambience, felt worlds away from the chaos of the outside world. Mark sat by Claire's bedside, his hand gently gripping hers, not wanting to let go. She was still unconscious, her recovery uncertain, and though her vitals were improving, it was too soon to say whether everything would be okay. His thoughts kept drifting back to the harrowing moments before they had reached the hospital. And that damned officer who had nearly cost them everything. It had been a long night, full of waiting and worrying. And now the morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows on the floor. Mark was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. But he couldn't rest until he knew Claire was going to make it. As much as he wanted to focus on her recovery, something inside him burned with the need for justice. Officer Thompson had obstructed them when they needed help the most. His reckless disregard for Claire's condition, his decision to impede an emergency vehicle, had almost cost their child's life. It wasn't something Mark could just forget. Paul, too, couldn't forget it. Over the past few hours, as Claire remained in recovery, Paul had started making calls. He was the district attorney. After all, someone with the power to investigate, to hold people accountable. His connections and influence were far-reaching. But this situation felt personal. It wasn't just another case, it was his daughter and grandson whose lives had been threatened. Paul was no stranger to dealing with law enforcement. Over the years, he had navigated many legal battles. But this one felt different. This one involved someone who had taken an oath to protect the public. Someone who had abused that trust. There would be no forgiveness for Officer Thompson, not while Claire's life still hung in the balance. Mark had been reluctant to take action at first. He didn't want to add more stress to an already unbearable situation. But after hearing the stories of others who had been hurt by this officer's misconduct, he realized he had no choice. He had to act, not just for Claire, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by someone who was supposed to protect them. I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did, Paul had told Mark late last night, his voice cold with resolve. This is not the first time Officer Thompson has crossed the line. There's a history of complaints against him. His behavior is dangerous. Paul had already launched an investigation into the officer's record, sifting through previous complaints and incidents of misconduct. It didn't take long for Paul to find a disturbing pattern: excessive force, unnecessary violence, and a complete lack of empathy for the people he was sworn to serve. Mark had to suppress his anger as he listened to Paul recount the findings. It wasn't just a matter of a single mistake. Officer Thompson had a history of hurting people, of making snap decisions without regard for human life. We're going to go after him, Mark, Paul continued, his voice steady. Both criminal and civil charges. He needs to be held accountable. And we're going to make sure that happens. Mark didn't know what the future held, but he could feel a shift in the air. It was the first step toward something that might offer them some form of closure. It wasn't going to undo the trauma, but it was something. And it was right. Meanwhile, the hospital room remained quiet. Claire stirred slightly, and Mark tightened his grip on her hand, his heart swelling with relief. Every movement, every small sign that she was improving, was like a lifeline in the storm. He hadn't felt this helpless in a long time, but he knew now that he wasn't alone in this fight. Paul was with him. Together, they would make sure no one else had to suffer because of someone's reckless actions. We'll make sure of it, Mark whispered to her, though she couldn't hear. He wasn't just making a promise to her, though. He was making it to himself, to their family, and to everyone who had ever been wronged by someone who should have been there to protect them. This was just the beginning. The fight for justice was only starting, and Mark was determined to see it through. no matter where it took him. The days following Officer Thompson's reckless actions were filled with tension. But Mark couldn't allow himself to wallow in frustration. The urgency to seek justice for Claire and for everyone Thompson had wronged drove him forward. Every piece of evidence gathered, every witness statement, built the foundation of the legal battle that would soon unfold. Paul had made it clear from the start that this wasn't going to be a simple case. He wasn't just pursuing Thompson for what happened to Claire, this was about a pattern of abuse. A history of excessive force that had left countless people in its wake. And now it was Mark's turn to stand up. Not just for Claire, but for the victims who had never had a voice. They were no longer just statistics, they were people whose lives had been irrevocably damaged by one man's disregard for the oath he'd sworn to uphold. The media began to pick up the story. And soon, the video of Thompson blocking the ambulance and assaulting Alex became viral. People across the country watched in horror as the officer's actions unfolded. And public outrage grew. The calls for justice were overwhelming. But they also added to the pressure Mark was feeling. He wasn't prepared for the intensity of it all, the anger, the emotion, but in a way, it gave him strength. For the first time, he saw a collective will to change the way officers like Thompson operated. There were moments of doubt. Moments when Mark felt small in the face of an entire system that seemed to protect its own. He couldn't help but wonder if this would be another case where nothing would change. Another story swallowed by the bureaucracy of law enforcement. But every time that doubt crept in, Claire's face flashed in his mind. He remembered the look of terror in her eyes when they were stuck behind that police car, and the pain in her voice as she cried out for help. And then he remembered the words she had whispered when she finally came to. Her voice faint but filled with determination. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." That moment kept him going. Then came the shocking twist. Officer Thompson, in a desperate attempt to salvage his career, had tampered with the evidence. Mark learned through Paul that Thompson had tried to delete the footage of the confrontation. The footage that had already been shared across social media. It was as though he thought erasing it would make it disappear. But nothing could erase the truth. And when fellow officers discovered what he had done, the betrayal was complete. The video was reposted. And public trust in Thompson crumbled even further. Mark felt a flicker of satisfaction when he heard about Thompson's attempted cover-up. It was as if the final nail had been driven into the coffin of his career. He had shown himself to be not just reckless, but dishonest. He had made a mistake. Yes. But trying to hide it only revealed the depth of his character, one defined by cowardice and arrogance. In Mark's eyes, that was a far worse offense. Soon after, Paul, with the full support of the district attorney's office, began preparing for the inevitable legal confrontation. They gathered statements from all the witnesses who had been present at the scene, the EMTs, the bystanders who had filmed the event, even the officer who had arrived as backup. All of them were willing to testify. Each account of Thompson's conduct painted a picture of a man who had forgotten his duty and his humanity. The investigation moved swiftly after that. And soon, the case was making its way toward a courtroom. Mark wasn't naive. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. The defense would try everything to discredit the witnesses, to downplay Thompson's actions. But in his heart, Mark believed the truth was undeniable. There were too many people, too many voices that had witnessed the reality of that moment. This was not going to be swept under the rug. As the trial date loomed closer, Mark continued to spend his days at the hospital, keeping vigil by Claire's side. But he also prepared for what was ahead. His mind would often wander to the day when they would finally face Thompson in court. What would he say? How would he speak the words that would make a difference? But for now, he had one focus: Claire, her recovery, and ensuring that justice would be served. Not just for their family, but for everyone else who had been affected by this man's actions. Mark wasn't sure how the future would unfold. But he knew this much: he would fight. Every step of the way. The courtroom was stark, cold, and filled with an electric tension. Mark sat at the front, his hands tightly gripping the wooden armrests. The noise of the crowd hushed as the judge entered. Claire, still recovering but stronger now, was at home, resting after weeks of turmoil. It wasn't just her battle to fight anymore, it was the world's battle against Officer Thompson's tyranny. The stakes were high, and Mark could feel the weight of every person who had been hurt by Thompson's actions, his cruelty, and his indifference to human life. It was the beginning of the trial, and the courtroom was packed. The media was there, capturing every moment of the dramatic proceedings. Mark had never imagined that their personal nightmare would become a symbol of something larger. But here it was. The public had rallied behind them, their voices echoing the sentiment of fairness, justice, and a system that needed to be held accountable. The case had gone beyond Claire and their family, it had become a fight for the integrity of the entire justice system. Linda Cho, the prosecutor, stood tall and calm as she presented the case. Her opening remarks were strong, without a hint of hesitation. She knew that the facts spoke for themselves, and the video footage of Thompson blocking the ambulance and assaulting Alex was irrefutable. But the real strength of Linda's case wasn't just in the footage, it was in the people who would testify. Each witness brought their unique perspective, each one reinforcing the undeniable truth of what had happened. The first witness called was Alex, the EMT. The courtroom went silent as he took the stand, the memory of that day still fresh in his mind. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried the weight of what he had endured. As he spoke, he described the panic in the ambulance, the agonizing screams of Claire, and the shock of realizing that they were not just facing a medical emergency, they were up against a person who would rather obstruct their mission than follow the law. His account was harrowing, but Alex remained composed as he recounted Thompson's refusal to let them pass. Despite the clear emergency at hand, Alex spoke of the officer's smug attitude, his disregard for human life. The words hit hard. Mark could feel the anger rising in his chest. But he kept his emotions in check, knowing that this was not the time for rage, it was the time for truth. Next, it was Mark's turn. He felt a knot in his stomach as he stood up, his knees trembling slightly. He had been preparing himself for this moment for weeks. But now that it was here, the reality of it felt even heavier. The courtroom's eyes were all on him. He felt a flicker of doubt, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't just about his anger toward Thompson, it was about Claire, their family, and the very notion of accountability. Mark took the stand, his voice surprisingly steady. He spoke of Claire's pain, the terror of watching her suffer in the back of that ambulance, unable to do anything but plead with the officer to let them through. He recounted how Thompson had escalated the situation, how the officer had even struck Alex after he tried to reason with him. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Mark relived the moment when he thought Claire might not make it. He could still hear the echoes of her screams, the desperation in her voice, the fear in her eyes. As he spoke, Mark saw the faces of the jury, expressions of disbelief, sorrow, and anger. He knew that every word he said was landing where it mattered. Even if it couldn't undo the pain of that day, his testimony wasn't just a personal account, it was a reminder that the rules were there to protect people, not to be used as tools of oppression. Thompson had crossed the line, and now, they would hold him accountable for it. When Linda Cho spoke again, she addressed the officers who had been present on the scene, including one who had arrived as backup. Their testimony was critical, confirming that Thompson had indeed blocked the ambulance for no reason and had acted recklessly. One officer even described how Thompson had tried to tamper with the evidence after the incident, attempting to delete the footage of the confrontation. This was the final blow. It wasn't just bad judgment, it was a calculated attempt to hide the truth. Mark watched as Thompson, sitting across the courtroom, grew visibly agitated. His defense team tried to discredit the witnesses, painting them as biased. But it was clear to everyone that the case against him was airtight. As Thompson sat there, unable to meet anyone's eyes, Mark realized something. He wasn't just fighting for justice for Claire anymore. This was about ensuring that no one else had to endure the abuse, the disregard, and the fear that he and his family had faced that day. It was about a larger promise, that accountability mattered. The tension in the room was palpable as the final witnesses were heard. The case was winding down, but Mark wasn't sure whether he felt relief or a deep sense of anticipation for the verdict. What mattered now was that the truth had been told. All he could do now was wait, hoping that the justice Claire and everyone else had been denied would finally come to fruition. The trial had been long, tense, and emotionally draining, but it was finally nearing its end. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet hum as the jury filed in, their faces grave and unreadable. Mark sat at the edge of his seat, his heart racing. The weight of the last few weeks pressed down on him, and he could hardly breathe as the judge called the room to order. The moment of truth had arrived. Officer Thompson sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer beside him. But his arrogance had disappeared. His head hung low, and the defiance he had displayed during the trial had faded. Mark noticed how Thompson's hands trembled slightly, betraying the fear that had set in. This wasn't the same confident officer who had blocked their ambulance. This man had become a shadow of his former self, facing the consequences of his actions. The judge asked the jury foreman to read the verdict, and every muscle in Mark's body tensed. His mind raced through everything that had happened: Claire's agony, Alex's calm under pressure, the public outcry, and the weeks of uncertainty that followed. Now it was time for it all to culminate in a moment of justice. The jury foreman stood and cleared his throat, the room holding its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Thompson, guilty on all counts." The words echoed through the courtroom, and Mark felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't over yet. But this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the truth had been recognized, and the man who had caused so much harm was held accountable. The emotions swelled within him. But there was no time for celebration yet. Not while Claire was still recovering and the family was still processing the trauma of the ordeal. The courtroom remained still for a moment, and then murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. It was a moment of justice for everyone who had ever been wronged by someone in power, for every victim of abuse, for every person who had been ignored in their time of need. Officer Thompson's actions had been reckless and unforgivable. But now, the system had held him accountable. The sentencing phase followed quickly. Mark's thoughts wandered back to that terrible day when he had watched helplessly as Claire's life hung in the balance. He had witnessed how close they had come to losing her, to losing their child. All because one officer had refused to see the urgency of the situation. In that moment, the stakes had never been higher. As the judge prepared to pass sentence, Mark couldn't help but think of Claire. She had been through so much, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The delay had forced her into an emergency C-section. And although both she and the baby had made it through, they were still fragile. The stress had taken a toll on their marriage too. The emotional scars were deep. And though they were both trying to heal, the memories of that night still haunted them. The judge's voice broke through his thoughts. "Officer Thompson, you are hereby sentenced to 8 years in prison, with no possibility of early release. You are permanently barred from law enforcement, and you will also be fined $100,000 for your actions." The words rang out, each syllable striking like a hammer. Mark could feel the weight of them, but there was something else, something deeper. He didn't feel elation or triumph. What he felt was a strange sense of closure, a recognition that justice had been done, even if it hadn't erased the pain. As Thompson was led away in handcuffs, Mark stood up and walked toward the exit. The crowd was still murmuring, some cheering for the verdict, others in quiet reflection. But for Mark, the moment was personal. This wasn't about public victory or social recognition. This was about the journey they had been on and the lessons they had learned. The justice was hard-earned, but it was just the first step in their healing process. Back at home, Claire sat on the couch, waiting for Mark. She had been following the trial as best she could. But the ordeal had drained her. When Mark walked through the door, he looked at her and smiled. A small, weary smile that said it all. She could see the weight lifted from his shoulders. The tension that had clung to him for so long now starting to ease. He walked over and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "We did it," he said softly. Claire nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. The emotions had been building for so long. But now, in this moment of peace, they had space to be felt. There was relief. There was sadness. And there was an overwhelming sense of gratitude for their survival. Claire rested her head on Mark's shoulder. And for the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet. A moment to breathe. The aftermath of the trial wasn't going to be easy. Healing would take time. But they had learned something powerful. No matter how broken the system might seem, the truth still had a way of coming to light. And for Mark and Claire, that truth would guide them forward into a new chapter of their lives. As the dust settled and the world moved on, each of the characters who had been part of this harrowing journey found themselves reflecting on what they had learned. The trial, the confrontation, and the emotional rollercoaster had left lasting marks. But they had also revealed powerful truths about life, justice, and human resilience. For Mark, the journey had been one of raw, unfiltered love and unwavering dedication. He had seen the very limits of his patience and his strength tested. But he had also learned something deeper about his own capacity for endurance. The most profound lesson he took from this experience was the realization that true strength doesn't lie in shouting the loudest or demanding the most, it lies in the quiet moments of steady resolve. In the moments when you stand firm, even when everything seems to be falling apart. He had fought for his wife, for their child. And in doing so, he had found strength in vulnerability. His anger had been a fire that fueled the fight. But it was love that had kept him going. In the end, he understood that standing up for what's right didn't always bring immediate peace. But it always brought meaning. Mark also learned the importance of patience. The system was slow. The process frustrating. But justice, though delayed, was still possible. His faith in that slow, sometimes painful process had been restored. No matter how long it took, he now knew that persistence was the key. For Claire, the trauma of that night had been both a terrifying and transformative experience. The pain, the helplessness, the uncertainty, it all weighed heavily on her. But as she reflected on everything, from the ambulance ride to the courtroom, she came to realize that this experience had not broken her, it had forged her into someone stronger than she ever thought possible. What stood out most for Claire was the resilience of the human spirit. Her own included. In that moment of labor, when every second felt like an eternity, she had felt powerless. But through Mark's unwavering support, and the calm of Alex, the EMT, she had been reminded that she wasn't alone in her struggles. Claire learned that there was power in surrendering to the unknown, in letting others help when you couldn't carry the burden alone. It was okay to rely on others, to trust in those around you when things seemed bleak. It was through this vulnerability that she found her own inner strength. And perhaps most importantly, Claire learned the value of life itself. The terrifying ordeal had taught her that life was fragile, that every moment should be cherished, and that the love of family and friends was the bedrock upon which everything else was built. For Paul, the district attorney, this experience was a lesson in justice and the responsibility that came with his position. His work had always been about the law, about ensuring that the scales tipped in favor of those who could not fight for themselves. But after the events with Officer Thompson, Paul understood the weight of that responsibility in a much more personal way. His lesson was one of perseverance through adversity. When the truth was obstructed, when the system seemed broken, it was easy to feel disillusioned. But Paul learned that fighting for justice meant continuing to push forward. Even when it felt like everything was stacked against you. He had seen firsthand how one officer's abuse of power could ripple outward and affect countless lives. But he had also seen how, when the truth was fought for and when integrity was maintained, even the most deeply entrenched wrongs could be righted. Paul also realized the importance of legacy. His role in the case wasn't just about bringing Officer Thompson to justice, it was about setting an example for his family, especially for his daughter and son-in-law. He wanted them to know that justice wasn't about winning, it was about doing what was right, regardless of the cost. Alex, the calm EMT, had been the steady presence throughout the ordeal. In the face of chaos, he had maintained his composure, doing his job with professionalism. But what he learned in this experience was the value of empathy. It wasn't enough to simply do the job, he had to connect with the people he was helping. The medical profession was not just about saving lives, it was about acknowledging the fear and pain that came with those moments. Alex learned that every life he touched had a story, and that listening, offering support, and showing compassion were just as important as the medical treatment he provided. The trial had shown him how deeply the actions of one person could affect others. It reinforced the importance of being a witness to those who needed help, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And as for Officer Thompson, his lesson was perhaps the most profound, albeit forced upon him through the consequences of his own actions. He learned, too late, that power was never meant to be wielded for personal gain or to impose control. His failure to recognize the humanity of others, his blind adherence to protocol, had cost him everything. While Thompson's lesson came too late to save him from his consequences, it still held a chilling truth: the abuse of power is never without repercussions. His journey from arrogance to defeat was a stark reminder that the truth would always come out, no matter how hard one tried to bury it. He learned that real strength lies in humility, in understanding that we are all human and fallible. His downfall was a tragic reminder that the system, despite its flaws, had a way of holding people accountable when they misused their authority. Underscore 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 underscore. As the story came to a close, each character stood at a crossroads, forever changed by what had transpired. The lessons they had learned about justice, love, strength, and humanity would guide them in the years to come. And though the scars from that night would never fully fade, they had come through it stronger, wiser, and more determined to live lives defined by the lessons they had learned, rather than the pain they had endured.